Good afternoon, folks, and welcome back to Tool Time with Tim Trudeau. My name is Ben Callahan,
And I am Tim Trudeau.
and we are here to provide you with the tools that you need to live the Christian life. This is our second episode of a new series that we're doing called Genre. And last episode, we did a nice intro to the idea of genre or literary type. So if you haven't listened to that, go ahead and go give it a listen, because today we're diving into our first genre. And rather than maybe approaching a genre, we're going to approach a really important section of the Bible, which is the Pentateuch. What do you know about the Pentateuch, Tim?
Pentateuch is the first 5 books of the Bible, all written by Moses.
Yeah, well, that's about right. And it was basically the sum total of the Hebrew Scriptures for a long time. I mean, this is what the nation of Israel was going off of from the time of Moses till like David, when some more history was written. So this is really foundational to what it meant to be a Jew, and therefore it's pretty foundational to what it means to be a Christian.
Sure, I mean, in the time of Christ, they would refer to the Scriptures as the law and the prophets, basically. Law was a huge category,
Right.
and was where so much of their history came from, their understanding of God's promises came from, and foundational to any understanding of the Bible is understanding the law.
Right, and the law is basically another. That's what they would have called the Pentateuch, or the Torah, is the law. So we ought not be confused by that title, because the law, in that sense, is more than just a list of laws, isn't it?
Right.
So we approach the Pentateuch. We're reading Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers. What are some things that we need to keep in mind?
Well, Genesis is primarily narrative text, and we're going to discuss that in another episode. So you really approach Genesis in a little different way maybe than you approach Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. So we have to make a distinction. Most of what we're talking about today when we talk about law applies to 4 of the 5 books.
Yeah.
Because Genesis is distinct. A little bit of Exodus is narrative too, or maybe a fair bit of Exodus is narrative also. So we're not talking as much about the early part of the Pentateuch as we are those parts where people tend to get bogged down when they start a Bible through the year reading program, especially if it's not one that I recommend, where you read a little Old Testament, New Testament, Psalms, Proverbs. It breaks it up a little.
Yeah.
If you just start in Genesis 1:1 and you start reading, by the time you get to Numbers,
you're ready to quit.
Yeah, you're having a hard time keeping up with your program.
Yeah, and it's important to remember, I guess, that the Pentateuch as a whole gets us from creation to just before the people enter the promised land. So it tells that story, but embedded in that story are a ton of what we're talking about today, a ton of these laws. And so even though these books aren't just a list of laws, there are lots of lists of laws within them. And so in order to not be confused or discouraged by those things, we need some principles on how to interpret, how to approach law, and that's what we're going to talk about today.
Yeah, and first of all, we need to distinguish between 3 types of laws. You have moral law, 10 Commandments that people are most familiar with. That's the moral law. Live this way. You have ceremonial laws, which have to do with the temple and sacrifices and all those sorts of things. And you have civil law, which has to do with a just society and dealing out proper punishment for disobedience and those kinds of things. So there are different kinds of laws, and within those, maybe like the ceremonial, there are some dietary laws. which are almost a distinct category unto themselves. And some of these, if you're reading now today, and we're not Israel, and it's not the Old Testament times, some of these have more relevance to us than others, and some law is still applicable today. Laws like the dietary laws, there may be lessons to learn from them, but we don't need to follow those laws today like we need to follow the Ten Commandments. So first thing to understand is there are different kinds of laws. Some are more relevant and applicable directly to our lives today than other laws.
So I'm going to play the devil's advocate for you here, Tim, and ask the question maybe some people are asking. When I read the Pentateuch, I don't see laws broken up into categories of moral, ceremonial, and civil, which would be really nice if we did, right? So I guess where are you getting these categories from, and why is it that we put the laws into these different categories?
Well, it's just helpful. There are categories of things that aren't in the scriptures that over the years different theologians have designated just to help us process when we're reading. Like we use the term Trinity. Well, it's not in the Bible, but
right.
Very helpful term to help us understand Father, Son, and Holy Spirit and how they relate. Well, categorizing the laws is the same sort of thing, and just simply asking then when you're reading in a particular area, which kind of law is this? Because when I read the Ten Commandments, I'm reading something that I can take and apply to my life today.
Right.
If I'm reading dietary laws and it says you can't eat pork, well, shame on us. We had pork loin last night.
We sure did. It was awesome.
So there are certain laws that in the most literal sense don't have application to us today.
Sure.
Still something to be learned from them,
right.
but not applied in the same way.
Yeah, because God is the same God. So it's the lawgiver is the same person that we're dealing with today, that we're in this intimate relationship with today. So they certainly show us what he's like, and to be a part of the people of God in many ways is still the same as it was then. It's still a life of faith like it was then. It's just it's lived out a little bit differently now. So we have much to learn about who God is and what he's like from the laws, and then much to learn about how we should respond to God from the laws.
Yeah, and that gets me to this second way of approaching it. Just to understand those categories is important, but practically speaking, what questions are you going to ask as you're reading through all of these laws? And for me, it's helpful to think in terms of 4 simple questions. That if I'm telling people, okay, here's how to draw out of the law the meaning of it and the application of it for you, here are 4 simple questions you could ask. One is, what's to be seen of God here? Because God, as you mentioned, is on display. Particularly the holiness of God is all throughout the law. It's meant for us to see God as a holy God, and meant for us to see the separation between a holy God and a sinful man.
That's exactly right. And I would add to that not only a holy God and a sinful man, but just God and man in general. There are certain tasks that are for God and not for man, because he's God and we're man in this. So we see that played out in the law as well. Not just righteousness versus sinfulness, although that's certainly on display, righteousness versus sinfulness, but godness versus manness as well.
Sure. So the second thing to ask is, what does this tell us about ourselves? And often in contrast or comparison to God. So what does it tell us about God? What does it tell us about ourselves? And then where do I see Christ? It should be like a treasure hunt every time you open the Old Testament, particularly the law. And it should be, for me, I mean, it should be exciting. Okay, where am I going to see Christ in this passage? Because as Jesus told the disciples on the road to Emmaus, it all points to him. It's all about him. So all these laws about the temple and all the details and what is this all about? Well, it's about God, man, Christ.
Yeah.
Yeah. And where is Christ in the sacrifices, in the temple itself? When you talk about the priesthood, well, of course, then Christ is the great high priest, and there's going to be all these pictures in the law that point to Christ.
Yeah, and I like that treasure hunt image because when you're going on a treasure hunt, the whole idea is that the treasure is already there, and our task is to find it. So there's a way to read the Old Testament looking for Christ that doesn't add to the text, rather it just finds what's already there. But there's also a way to do that where in a way we're planting the treasure in the ground and then going in and digging it up, and that's not what we're after. We're finding what's already there. The treasure is in the laws. It's woven within it, and our job, our task is to dig it up, not to place it there.
Right. And we talked in another podcast about a good study Bible. And if your study Bible has cross references and there are New Testament cross references to your passage, not only does that help you understand that passage, but seeing how the New Testament itself interprets the Old Testament helps give you categories for reading your Old Testament. What does Jesus do with this passage when he raises it up? And it can lend some insight into that particular passage, but it also shows you things that you really aren't expecting. Like when Moses strikes a rock with a stick and water comes out. Okay, he struck a rock with a stick and water comes out, and the people needed to drink. Well, then when Paul says in Corinthians, and the rock was Christ.
The rock was Christ.
Wow! I mean, just blows your mind. Okay, what else in the Old Testament is Christ? If the rock is Christ, if you see Jacob sees a ladder in the Old Testament running between earth and heaven, and then in John 1, Jesus says that ladder is me. Well, if the ladder is Christ and the rock is Christ, what else is Christ? You start. It just opens your mind for this treasure hunt to see Christ all over. So when you're reading through Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, you think, whoa. Sometimes you get bogged down. Well, just think of it as a treasure hunt, and Christ is everywhere to be found.
Yeah, and like you said, on the road to Emmaus, Jesus makes that exact point. This is what the Messiah is supposed to be like, and turns out it's exactly like what Jesus was. So, another one I would point out is the manna, the bread from heaven.
Sure.
Christ identifies himself with that too, and the connections really are endless, and John does a really good job with that. He kind of makes those connections a little more explicit than the other guys do.
Right.
So, if you're interested in that, go ahead and read John, and you're gonna see that.
And Hebrews.
In Hebrews, of course, yeah.
Hebrews opens up the Levitical law in a way that no other New Testament book does, to see, all these sacrifices. What was the meaning of all these sacrifices? And you think, all this bloodshed and animals and over and over. The whole point is to call us to cry out and plead for a once and for all sacrifice that brings this system to an end. And then there's Christ, who offered himself up once for all. The whole point when you're reading it is, wow, this goes on and on and on. Yeah, that's the whole point. All of this bloodshed can never do what the single life of Christ does in shedding his blood on the cross.
Yeah, exactly. And that's, I think that's getting to the heart of, why even try studying the law in the first place? Well, if you don't understand sacrifice, you don't understand Christ. If you don't understand the priesthood, you don't understand Christ. If you don't understand the tabernacle, if you don't understand the temple, you don't understand Christ. So we need this stuff. It's absolutely essential for us getting what it is the New Testament authors are saying about Christ. We have to know the Old Testament, and specifically the law, because it's this most foundational piece of the Old Testament.
Yeah, I mean, you brought another one to mind, the tabernacle, and when John says in John 1:14 that the Word tabernacled literally among us.
Yeah, yeah.
The presence of God came down, and he was there in Christ, just as God was present with his people in the tabernacle. It's the presence of God with us, and that the tabernacle is another picture of Christ. And these are beautiful pictures that just open our minds up to the glory and splendor of Christ. But I said 4 questions.
Yeah.
I think we only got 3 so far.
Okay, one more.
Yeah. The 4th one is basically, what does this tell us about society and a just society? And there are civil laws that still have some application today. We may debate specifically how they're applied, like capital punishment, for example. Because there's capital punishment in the Old Testament, should there still be capital punishment today? We'll leave that for another podcast.
Yeah. Or maybe not.
Yeah. But those kinds of laws, show us what a just government looks like, show us how we should live in relationship to each other, our neighbors, as well as people distant from us or different from us, and how we should relate to them, how those who have great means should relate to the poor, and so on. I mean, all these societal structures that make for human flourishing are right there in the law and are a guide for us as God's people, and we hope even for governments that would honor God in the way they govern, and there are principles there that still apply today. So we can look for those as well.
Yeah, great. Well, I think we've at least covered the surface of reading law. We're going to come back to the Pentateuch a little bit when we talk about narrative. So we'll talk about the Pentateuch, biblical history, and then the Gospels as well, because we have this big chunk of narrative at the beginning of the New Testament as well. But next week, we're not talking narrative. We're talking prophecy and poetry. So tune in to Tool Time next week for a discussion of prophecy and poetry. Thanks for coming, and we'll see you later. Bye.